Okay, everyone. As I stated earlier in the semester in various places verbally or in writing, um, whenever I want us to pay attention to the original text of philosophers, we're going to do it during a video lecture or video instruction or instructional coaching via video. As you know, when it comes to the Learn Smart assignments, I tell you you can skip original text, anything that's quoted from philosophers. So what we're going to do here is we're going to spend a few minutes going over some original text by Jeremy Bentham from his piece called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. So you can see here in his title that he thinks it's important to think about morality because there are implications for how we think about legislation. That is how we govern society. We need rules and principles to think about when making governmental decisions. And that's interesting to think about in the context of COVID-19, as there are a lot of moral issues arising, such as does the government have the authority to legislate or come up with laws or any kind of enforcement or policies with respect to the spread of the coronavirus, shelter in place, restricting some freedoms and whatnot. Now, we're going to go ahead and read through this, and what I'm going to be focusing on in doing so are the key core concepts in the thinking of Bentham. So we'll be using concept triangles to highlight core concepts. Here I have given you some room to write some notes that will help you do well on an activity or an assessment of some kind that I might have you work on. So just know that even though I might mark up certain things in here, I might say other things that you want to take note of over here. So we'll begin with that, and you can see that it goes to right here. Keep in mind that what we're doing, the purpose of this reading has two aspects. One is to see what philosophers have to say in their own words, to get comfortable reading philosophical text, even though we're reading very small segments. It's an introduction to what you might be doing. This comes from a book. I'm not having you read an entire book and make sense of what the philosopher says on your own. That's why I use Learn Smart, because the author helps you to make sense of some key passages and core ideas from the philosopher's book. When we get to the video, we go over it and we take a slightly closer look, calling attention to the core concepts that are in there. I'm also going to have us do a diagram based on what is in here, and this is going to help you pull together what you learned about the reading with respect to Bentham's ideas in this original text. We're going to do a visual display of the ideas and how it relates to some new lessons on moral claims and non-moral claims. But the idea with this text here is that we see how Bentham gets from some non-moral claims, some metaphysical presuppositions, to his general moral principle. Again, when philosophers or ethicists, when philosophers are doing ethics, normative ethics, they don't just say, here's a rule, use it, a moral rule, use it. They argue for the moral rule. They explain why the moral rule makes sense. They try to convince us convince us to adopt that moral rule. And so that's what we see here happening now. Whether or not we find Bentham or anyone else compelling in their argument for a moral rule and their explanation of why we should follow it, that's one thing. So we're not going to focus so much on evaluating that. If you want to learn more about that, you can go back to the Learn Smart book and focus on those parts of the discussion by Lawhead. We're just going to focus on trying to understand how Bentham gets from his metaphysical presuppositions to his moral statement, his general moral principle. So let's go ahead and start. So as you can see, I've defined three words that are really important in his thinking: sovereign, possessing supreme or ultimate power; subjection, the state of being under the control of something or someone besides oneself; and then abjure, to solemnly renounce a belief, cause, or claim. So I'm going to use green to highlight core concepts that are really important to the non-moral elements of his thinking. So let's go ahead and start with that. So here, let's start, and by the way, these numbers are not for statements, they're for lines. Like that I can say lines 1, 2, and 3 are focused on, but the numbers are not for statements. All right, so he says, I'm going to read through the paragraph and then we're going to go back over the core concepts. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters. So think about what it means for someone to be a master of something or someone. And here it's saying to be have complete power, right? Supreme power over something. So, and what are those sovereign masters? Pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So core concepts here in line 1 include nature, mankind, so the nature of humans, in other words, that we are born a certain way, the governance, right, of two sovereign masters, so obviously important concepts right there, and of course the two sovereign masters are what? Pain and pleasure. So these, I would say this word and this word, these are the most important words in terms of they name the most important concepts in lines 1, 2, and 3. And then next I would say nature, okay, and that they are what? Sovereign masters. But these right here are the two most important, and then the other ones that I put in rectangles, of course, are very important. All right, so notice that this is a non-moral claim, right? So 1, 2, and 3 are non-moral statements. And in the diagram that we do, we're going to add some more information. So then he says, it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So when he says it is for them, what is he talking about? What is them referring back to? Our sovereign masters, true. But how can we be more precise? We can go back to what? Pain and pleasure. Or you could say the sovereign masters of pain and pleasure. So notice that he uses the word what? Ought. In other words, he's bringing in some moral language. He's saying they should tell us what to do. It is right for them to tell us what we ought to do. So this is getting into what I'm going to call a meta-ethical claim, and I really haven't talked about that yet, so you're getting some new terminology here. So when he says them, that's an important concept. It's going back to an important concept, which is pain and pleasure as sovereign masters. And he says, notice what he says though. It is for them alone. Very interesting. Them alone. Only those two things to point out what we ought to do. So ought being the most important word here in lines 3 through 5 with respect to the new statement. And of course, when he says what we shall do, so we're told what would be the right thing to do by paying attention to pleasure and pain. And then this tells us what we actually execute, what we actually do in terms of paying attention to the morally significant features of moral decision making. Okay, so 3, 4, and 5 make what I call meta-ethical statements. Meta-ethical statements, you could also think of them as meta-moral statements. They're not just non-moral statements, but they're not fully moral statements. They're kind of in between. You might want to write that down somewhere. Okay, so let's go to the next passage. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other hand, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. Okay, so there we've got another statement. And we've got, of course, very important concepts here, right and wrong, right? And then on the other, the chain of causes and effects. So the idea here that we really want to pay attention to is that pain and that pain and pleasure are inextricably connected to right and wrong. That rightness and wrongness themselves are inextricably then connected from causes and effects. So the causes are choices, decisions, actions, and policies, and then effects would be pain and pleasure. So you can see how I fleshed that out a little bit. So again, rightness and wrongness, that is our moral considerations, right? Our moral values are inextricable from, right, the causes and effects of actions, decisions, and policies. We have to keep that in mind as we're thinking through matters of moral significance. So I'm going to say that one more time. Rightness and wrongness are inextricable from causes and effects. Causes are choices, decisions, actions, and policies. And the effects that we want to look at are effects in terms of pain and pleasure generated. All right, so then this becomes important, causes and effects, and again, causes and effects referring to pain and pleasure. Notice it says fasten to their throne. That's why I say these things are inextricable. So notice how these concepts hang together in his thinking, right? Notice again how these concepts form his perspective, his take on things. So that's another thing that I want to continue to emphasize is philosophy teaches us how to pay attention, how to identify, how to excavate fundamental and powerful concepts at play in our thinking. That's the beauty of philosophy. Notice that as we're doing this, we are applying what? We have to manifest intellectual empathy, because whatever our view is, even if it's very similar to Bentham's, we're trying to truly understand, despite whatever views we have, how someone else sees something. Here, we're looking at someone's view of morality and how they get to the principle of utility. So we're looking at how he gets from his metaphysical presuppositions about human nature to his general moral principle, how we decide what the morally correct thing to do is. But we're also trying to understand his concepts. What are the concepts in his thinking, and how do they hang together in his thinking? So intellectual empathy is definitely required here. Okay, so they govern us in all that we do, in all that we say, in all we think. And every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In class, I do a thought experiment to expand on and help students understand what he's saying here, but I'm not going to do that for the online class. We're going to focus rather just on noting that he's continuing here to emphasize the role in our lives, right? So when he says again, they, what is he referring back to? Pain and pleasure. And he's making sure that you understand the scope, the true power of pain and pleasure in our lives. And he says all that we say, think, do, say, and what? Think. In other words, they completely govern our lives. And as he says over here, it is for them alone to point out what we should do. He says that we cannot escape it. In other words, there's no way to escape these masters that have complete power over us. That's why he uses the word subjection here. All right, so moving along. Oh, so let's go back to, and actually, I think I made a little bit of a mistake. So lines 1 and 2 and 3, I should have said comprise a moral statement, but there's only one moral statement, so I need to make sure you understand that. Here, lines 3, 4, and 5 comprise a meta-ethical statement, but I need you to make sure that you understand that there's only one statement, and it's a meta-ethical one. Same thing here. Right here, on the other hand, standard of right and wrong. Okay, so this is, again, 6, 7, and 8 comprise a meta-ethical statement. Notice I say comprise. All together, they comprise a statement, right? So lines, not statement numbers here. But there's only one statement in 6, 7, and 8 that comprise a meta-ethical statement. Now, there is another statement that begins, I should say 9. And then we have another statement right here. That's going to be lines 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 that comprise a non-moral statement. And something that I think would be helpful to clarify is that what is being given here is what we're going to call a meta-ethical presupposition. So meta-ethical presupposition, here's a meta-ethical presupposition again. So it's he's putting forth his presuppositions about reality. So notice how there's a metaphysics to how he's arguing for getting towards his general moral principle. So now let's go to the next paragraph. Okay, so in words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to them all the while. So you might proclaim that you're not totally governed by them, but he says any attempt that you make to prove that they're not is itself a demonstration that you are governed by them. So let's say that you really dislike the theory. And so you say, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to prove that pain and pleasure don't govern me. Well, what you're doing in effect with any attempt to prove is you're showing that it pains you to accept the principle, that it pains you to accept his metaphysical presuppositions. It pains you to accept the idea that we are completely governed by pain and pleasure. So it is the pain of that idea and its being true that motivates you and moves you to try to show that that's not true. So again, in other words, pain itself is seen to be governing your behavior. So then he says, the principle of utility recognizes the subjection, right? So again, subjection, the state of being under control or something or someone besides oneself, and what? Assumes it for the foundation of that system. So this is where we start to get into, we're going to call this still a meta-ethical claim, but he's actually naming a moral claim. So he says the principle of utility, I'm going to underline that in purple because this right here names a moral statement. And he's saying my moral statement, in other words, my general moral principle that I have come up with, doesn't deny that we're completely governed by pleasure and pain. Rather, it starts with that as the foundation. It starts with the meta-ethical presupposition that we are governed by pain and pleasure. And the thing about Bentham is you got to realize that he's what epistemologists would call an empiricist. He would say, hey man, look around you. What do you observe about human behavior? Doesn't it seem like people's choices, decisions, and actions are motivated by the desire to have as much pleasure as possible and to avoid as much pain? And so that is what is going on there. And he says it assumes it for what? The foundation of that system. So I'm going to put that in blue because I kind of have a schema here. So you can see that I'm color coding things. So the principle of utility recognizes this objection and assumes it for the foundation of that system. Okay, so here I'm going to say that this is a meta-ethical, primarily a in 16, lines 16, 17, 18, and 19 comprise one single statement that make a meta-ethical claim or statement. All right, so do I want to highlight some words in here? So I've got they govern us in all that we do. So they, of course, is important because that refers back to pain and pleasure. Then we've got over here, these, of course, these are important, but not as important as once we put triangle over here. Their empire, of course, that means their reign over us. So it's another way of talking about the sovereign masters and their control over us. Subject, of course, is an important word here. I'm going to do that in green. Principle of utility. So what is a principle? So now we're going to start to do some purple triangles. Subjection. And then assumes it for the foundation. So I want you to think about what does it mean for something to be a foundation of something. Okay, we're almost done. Let's go ahead and go over here. The principle of utility, he says, is the foundation of the present work. It will be proper, therefore, at the outset to give an explicit and determinate account of what is meant by it. So notice the word therefore. In other words, he's reached a conclusion, right? He's saying, look, he thinks it's obvious. You look around. People are governed only by two things, pain and pleasure, and our desire to pursue one and avoid the other. And then an implied premise is, well, we ought to be governed by that. I mean, we ought to make moral decisions based on what human beings really are. We shouldn't deny it. That's irrational. Let's take the true nature of reality, and instead of ignoring it, let's redirect the powers, our psychological powers of wanting to pursue pleasure and avoiding pain toward moral ends. Let's teach people how to think morally given these supreme powers in what we say, what we think, what we do. So here we're going to have, let me make sure that I'm staying true to my color coding. So I'm doing principle of utility because it names a moral principle and hence a moral statement that he makes. The principle of utility, did I do that over here? Is the foundation of the present work. So I said that that is a meta-ethical concept. of the present work. That is the development of his theory as he's expounding on it, getting to the principle of utility. It will, and so then he says it will be proper to give an explicit and determinate account of what? He says of what is meant by it. What does he mean by what is meant by it? He wants to clarify. He has not yet told us what the principle of utility, this phrase, means, right? So this names a rule, a moral rule, but he hasn't told us what it means given his meta-ethical and his metaphysical presuppositions, given his non-moral claims about human reality, and given his meta-ethical claims about how we decide what is, what's important, how we think about right and wrong, given the metaphysical presuppositions of human reality. It says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves, purple's good, or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. So when he's talking about happiness, he's talking about pleasure. I say of every action whatsoever, I guess we could do action as well. Somewhere there's action up here, but I forgot where it was. And therefore, not only of every action of a private individual, but of every measure of government. So in other words, the principle of utility can be used in a way that can be applied by the individual, but also by government. But we also, so by every action of every private individual. So we can apply this as private individuals, but we can also apply this in terms of governments. So again, I want you to think about COVID-19, think about local, state, and national governments and the issues they're dealing with, the empirical issues of the virus, and whether or not they're doing what you think is morally correct, morally permissible, morally wrong, morally obligatory, and whatnot. According to this theory, we should be using the principle of utility our governments should be using. So like the governor of Texas or the county judge, Clay Jenkins, should be using the principle of utility to make decisions, to make morally sound decisions when it comes to COVID-19 and what should be done about it. Okay, so continuing on, he goes on to say that by utility, all right, so let me first go through this again. So he says by utility, I didn't say anything about this. So, I did say something about this, but I think there might be something else that I want to say here. Okay, so here he's going into the meaning of what he means by the principle of utility. He still hasn't told us exactly what the principle of utility states, but he's getting into it. So we have lines 20 through 21, he's really just kind of giving an introductory sentence. So that's kind of like a non-moral statement. And then he's got 21 through 23, non-moral statement. He's just kind of giving us an introduction to what he's about to talk about. Then in lines 23 through, it's a long one, 30, he's giving us non-moral statements again. He's defining terms and talking about what he means by the terms in what is a moral statement. He's making non-moral claims within his, let me put it this way. He has words that name fundamental and powerful concepts that we might call non-moral elements of his principle of utility. And then the same thing with 31 through 33. And really, this should probably be considered meta-ethical statements, actually. This would be considered meta-ethical statements as well. Not quite just non-moral statements, but not a complete, straightforward moral statement, really meta-ethical statements. Okay, because he's telling us about the meaning of a principle of utility, which is which means a general moral principle. You read about a version of it, and I'm going to give you a version that I have formulated for Bentham that I think really helps you to understand what he's getting at. So we still haven't said precisely in a single statement what the principle of utility is. It was covered in the reading, but like I said, I'm going to give you another version. Okay, so we're at our last paragraph for the principle of utility. By utility is meant that property in any object. So what's going on here? He is now focusing on a key word in what? In the word phrase that names his general moral principle of utility. So first he's kind of focusing on the big picture, but then he's doing what? He's saying, now let's focus on one of the words in particular. So here he's doing what would be called conceptual clarification. So again, let's get back to the big picture. One of the things that I want you to see in reading this original text is how philosophers, yes, they argue with each other the way that we've defined arguing in this class, but part of their argument consists of defining their terms and saying what they mean by words that name fundamental and powerful concepts in their thinking. So he's saying, hey man, if I'm going to tell you we should live by the principle of utility, I need to explain what I mean by utility. So he says, is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this in the present case comes to the same thing. In other words, all of these words are basically synonyms. Or what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of what? Mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. So again, we've got these as core concepts. And the basic idea is that all of these words right here are basically synonyms. To the party whose interest is considered. If that party be the community in general, I left out the rest of the statement, but the idea is that you can think about pain and pleasure in terms of individuals, but also collections of individuals. So again, we have lines 34 through, it's actually, I think this is all one large, huge statement. So yeah, 34 through 42 forms one very long statement, and we're going to call it a meta-ethical statement. Now, it is from here and here that he derives his principle of utility, and he's starting to transition us to what that principle of utility says. And so then he gives us a precise formulation, which we're going to now capture with the diagram. Take a moment to consider or to appreciate how we have highlighted, excavated core concepts, words that name fundamental and powerful ideas that Bentham uses to organize, interpret, and make sense of moral life, starting from a basis or upon the basis of some metaphysical presuppositions about human reality. What are some words that name fundamental and powerful concepts that have been operating in your general thinking about morality? Are you aware of the deeper, fundamental, and powerful concepts that are at play in your moral compass? How did they get? How were they manifested in your response to the question about whether it was morally permissible for your government to make you shelter in place? Did you tell me which general moral rule or moral principle, if any, you were using to come to your judgment about the permissibility of government making you shelter in place? Did you explain or define what you meant by morally permissible? Did you explain why you were using a moral principle? Is your general moral principle implied even if you didn't make it direct? What kinds of things did you pay attention to? What did you think it was important to focus on in your response to that prompt in coming to formulate or decide whether or not it was morally permissible for government to make you shelter in place? Again, that claim that you copied according to your position is itself a moral statement, a particular moral judgment. But what was the general moral principle at play in how you came to that judgment, implicit or explicit, and what were some of the deeper, fundamental, and powerful concepts at play? I'm not saying they had to be Bentham's. They could have been more like Kant's duty ethics, and the presuppositions in his theory, or Aristotle's virtue ethics and the presuppositions in his theory. The point, or a big takeaway, is looking at how and what the philosophers can teach us about becoming more enlightened about our moral compass, and hence the way that we make sense of, interpret, and make judgments about matters of moral significance.